So I'm going to start off rather basic and we'll kind of build up for there. This first lecture, they've asked me to talk about monopoly. So for starters then, why don't you guys tell me, this isn't your own personal belief, what would the argument be for why monopoly is bad? Yeah?
They raise prices above the competitive price.
And why is this bad?
Inefficient allocation of resources.
Yeah, okay. So the basic case against monopoly, right? If you all have taken a principles of economics course, you've seen something like this, right? You got price and quantity, and you face a normal downward sloping demand curve, but because there's only one seller, they get to choose what price they set. Say they've got some, let's just make it simple, marginal cost, and we'll assume that there's no fixed cost, so that's also their average total cost. So if we wanted all of the gains from trade to be exhausted, what's this demand curve actually measure? The height of it, what's it mean? Yeah?
The quantity that they can sell for any given price.
Okay, so it is a relationship between price and quantity. It tells you at a given quantity what price, or at a given price what quantity will be bought. But what does that actually mean? What's our intuitive interpretation of the height of the demand? Let's say I pick unit number 1, and we go up, and we read this across, and you see a price. Yeah?
There's one person willing to pay that price.
Yeah, or really what I'm trying to get at here is the height of the demand curve at any given quantity is the subjective value that the purchaser puts on the unit. So it's what it's worth to that marginal consumer, that unit. So that tells us whenever a producer can produce for less than what that value is, the world gets wealthier if they make it and they swap, right? So what you want for efficiency then is everywhere where the demanders value the good in their minds more than what the cost of production are, you want them to produce it and trade, which would mean your efficient point would be you keep trading until you get way out here. Of course, the problem is if you're lowering price for everybody, then the monopolist, when he lowers price to get all the way out to here, he makes no profit, and he lost all the profit he could have made charging this guy a higher price and this guy a higher price. So if you've seen this before in principles, you know, if we're playing with straight line ones, we've got a marginal revenue curve, the extra revenue to the seller, that's basically twice the slope of the demand curve. Profit maximizing monopolist then, marginal revenue equal margin, actually, right, your rule if you're taking the principles of economics course, you like ingrain it into your head, MB equals MC, just do everything up until marginal benefit equals marginal cost, right? So in this case, marginal benefit just happens to be revenue. That tells you quantity for monopolist, read up to here, price, monopolist. So this is your basic case of why monopoly is bad. The standard case they give you is that we're only going to trade to this quantity. Instead of quantity, we'll call it efficient. So all of the gains from trade where these buyers right here value it more than the cost of production, never get realized. This little triangle is what economists call our deadweight loss, right? It's the gains from trade that nobody realizes. So the case against monopoly isn't just simply high prices that producers get more profit and consumers get less consumer surplus. That's a transfer. The difference of this becoming profit for them rather than consumer surplus. But there's nothing changing in efficiency here. The problem is there's gains from trade that are never realized. This is your basic case of why monopoly would be inefficient, and usually then the next thing would be we should do something about it. Questions to this point? For those of you who are more advanced graduate students or whatever. Yeah?
But they'd be taking a loss on that amount of production. How's that a...
Okay, so they aren't, you're right, making a profit off these guys. But if they were going to, and this is a single price monopolist, if they were going to find these people, they'd have to keep lowering their price until you hit this. But then you could see if they priced here, then price would also equal marginal cost across. So where's your profit? You never make one. So where you maximize profit actually is at this point. This is basically each time you lower price, you lose, you can see the little rectangle on the top here with my pen, the revenue there, and then you gain the revenue you pick up here. So it's measuring the size of that loss against this gain, and this is where you maximize the size of it. So this is your max total profits. Of course, the monopolist would like, and you're quite correct, to also get a profit off these guys. So in practice, one thing monopolists do that gets rid of some of the inefficiency is what we call price discriminate. You charge different buyers different prices, right? So if you can charge in fact, actually, if everyone had the demand curve like on their forehead, You just charge each person exactly their willingness to pay. This entire thing becomes profits value, and there's no inefficiency. Happy world, at least from an efficiency standpoint, yeah.
What if it's not necessarily willingness to pay, but so much as willingness to travel? I mean, in a case where
To what?
Willingness to travel to where that same goes up in a different market. So say like it's $20 in San Francisco, but $10 here, but people are going to pay $20 because they don't want to cross the bridge. Even though it means they'll still save $5 in the long run. It's just inefficient because it's going out of their way. So I mean, it's still backing what you're saying. It's just with the price discrepancy that they'll set in different markets.
Yeah, so generally what would happen is if it's something that you can move, you try to arbitrage it across distances. So it's hard. So if you're going to price discriminate, you need to be able to control resales. So like any of you ever try to buy like a DVD of an American movie from India? How does it work? He shakes his head. Not very good. Because what they do is they price discriminate, right? Americans who are willing to pay $20 for the Blu-ray or the DVD, Indians aren't going to pay as much, in part because they're poorer. So they make the same movie, they sell it over there for like the equivalent of like $3. They sell it here, and of course what people would do is resell to the United States, except there's a problem. They put a code in the chips, excuse me, on the DVDs, and a code in the DVD players that makes it so US DVD players can't play Indian DVD players. So they're preventing the arbitrage from happening. So it's easier to do this with something like a service because it's hard to resell the service or something like that. But note then this discrepancy of prices across areas actually improves efficiency, right? Because if they had to sell just one price in the world, India would probably not get very many DVDs because they'd keep the big sales that they get in the US market. So this is something that's quite common. In fact, price discrimination is like everywhere. You see like student discounts. Oh, it's because they're just nice to students and old people, right? No, BS, it's profit maximizing for them. They also have to control resentment because no one likes having to pay a higher price than somebody else. So if everyone's like, oh, well, it's nice they do it for the students. Like no one walks into a restaurant, it's like, a student discount, what the hell? No, it's like, it's okay with everybody, but it is price discrimination and it helps increase efficiency and get students better deals. It's also the case that you can like signal that you're one of those people, then you can get a good deal too. So like my George Mason student ID when I was in graduate school, like lasted for 5 years after I graduated. So I'd be in Europe and going to like a museum and be like, student discount. Anyway, basic point is it's very common. Oh, and you guys all get like super price discrimination. You're all in college. Colleges are like one of the best price discriminators out there. Because what do they do when they decide how much to charge you? Fill out this FAFSA application, and we'll determine how much financial aid we can give you. What the hell? They're learning how much your income is, your parents' income, how much your savings is, your parents' savings. They're basically mapping out what they think you are here. Oh, and they also ask you, what other schools are you applying to? And they've got an idea of what their competitors are going to be like. Then they charge everyone vastly different prices. Financial aid. Oh, who's against that? Well, maybe some people around here, but for the most part, not many people, but they're very good price discriminators, actually. We like to call them scholarships and financial aid. Anyway, this is your basic case against monopoly. Now, an advanced thing, for those of you guys who are economists or advanced in economics, all costs are what? In fact, you should know this from principles class. Okay, you ask an economist, how's your wife? What's the answer? Compared to who? It's opportunity cost, right? All costs are opportunity costs, so they're opportunities foregone. All value, you must have heard a lecture earlier this week, all value is subjective, right? Okay, if all costs are opportunity costs and all value is subjective, what's wrong with this standard case right here? We've drawn the line wrong. This is pretending like there's an objective marginal cost. There's not. Monopolists are people too. That means all costs for them are opportunity costs, and all costs are subjective. But by definition, when we're saying when he lowers price to sell more units, what's one of his opportunity costs of that? Lost revenue from the other people. That's a cost. If we were being consistent subjectivist and appreciating opportunity cost, this whole graph changes. Instead, this quantity monopoly right here is the efficient quantity because this cost curve isn't real. His real cost curve goes up through there. We basically have to violate a central tenet of economics in order to get this graph in the first place, despite the fact that everybody uses it. Keep that one in your back pocket if you're like going to be a serious economist person later. And go out and read Buchanan's Cost and Choice that like hammers this point home again and again, but not in the context of this graph. For the rest of this lecture, we'll just kind of take this as it is and assume that this is roughly correct, even though it's not. All right, so why could this be good? So the standard case of why it's bad is monopolists restrict output and raises price. Why could this be a good thing? I know it's early in the morning. Go ahead, help me out.
I mean, it depends on the situation. Like with, argue what you will, there's the argument for natural monopolies, just making things, say, easier, because the power companies, instead of having to lay different lines, it's easier just to use one set of lines. That way you're reducing the scale, well, you're freeing up the market and allowing scarce resources to be used elsewhere.
Yeah. So one argument could be, and we'll flip back to this in a second, is what we call natural monopolies. It would be more costly to have competition than it would be to have a monopolist. So what if long-run average cost in the industry looks like this? So it's decreasing for a long time before it starts increasing. And the quantity that's going to be necessary in the market is here. Well, we could have one firm produce at this average cost, but if we split this up and said we need 3 firms serving the market, each one does about a third of this, then we're going to have 3 firms all producing at a much higher average cost. What's going to be the result in the market then? A high price and inefficiency. So the example you gave is kind of a classic one of having 3 different power companies all string their own lines around your neighborhood. That's the big fixed cost, but low marginal cost of supplying the users. So as a result, instead of getting greater gains from trade and getting out here, you're actually going to find a smaller quantity traded and even bigger deadweight loss. So that would be one argument in favor of doing something else, is that there's a natural monopoly. And now, by the way, how we deal with this is the next question we'll come back to later. Is, okay, it's efficient for one firm to do it. Should we do something else about that firm or just leave it alone? Other examples that you could think like this, classically, cable television, phone lines, your sewer system. Someone might argue garbage collection, but I think that one's pretty bogus. But this basically things where you have a high fixed cost for a given geographic area and very low marginal cost. You're going to be better off with one firm rather than monopoly. This doesn't equal, by the way, at this stage, therefore just leave them the heck alone, because people would argue next step is, well, we'll regulate them then. We'll make it one firm, but regulate them. We'll come back to that. Other reasons why monopoly is good. How many of you are on MySpace? Friendster? Shit. Okay, Google+. 2, Jesus. Okay, Facebook. All of you. Facebook is a near monopoly of that style social media. Do you think your lives would be better if we broke that up and had a competitive industry where I allocate 1/4 of you to Friendster, 1/4 to MySpace, 1/4 to Google Circles, and 1/4 to Facebook? No. Why? Why do you value being on Facebook? Yeah.
The benefit to the consumer increases as more people use it.
Yeah, the benefit to the consumer increases as more people use it. These things are called network industries, basically. In fact, for freaking economics PhD students, it makes me nuts that I have to like teach my graduate students about this every time they send me a Word document, or excuse me, a word process document in something that's not Microsoft Word. I want to just like stab them. I'm like, don't you understand network industries? And then I send the document back to them and say, make it in a format that makes more sense to me, because I don't want to like correct spacing. So that's another one actually then, is word processing documents. Part of the value of your word processor is not typing into your own computer to print out, but the fact that you can share the thing with other people. Spreadsheets like that as well. Social media. Oh, dating websites. That's another one. Do you want to go on a dating website where there's not lots of other people? No, so you tend to get like one single market leader. What's the market leader in that now? Match.com, yeah, that's what I think. Then there's like eHarmony that competes, and they use like a different algorithm. And then what you get, so it doesn't have to be, just because it's a network industry, a single monopoly. It can be an oligopoly. But what you'll tend to get is market domination within like segments then. So Match is the big one, but then what else is there? Yeah, what's the Christian one called? Christian Mingle and J-Date. So that's the Jewish one. So basically, if you don't want to have to like sort through a bunch of people who don't match your religion, oh, just go into this one. They also have Ashley Madison. That's the one for people who are married who want to have affairs with other people. So it's a rather specialized one. If you just go into Match.com wanting that, you're probably going to get a lot of upset relationships. So instead, there's a new market. You haven't seen the commercials for that? It's hilarious. It's like these two people are rolling around in bed, and it's like, these two people are married, but not to each other. AshleyMadison.com. First time I saw the ad, I almost fell off the couch. But these things are network goods, basically. So they're competition. So it's like conceiving of competition as competition within the market of different firms getting different market shares and competing over it versus competition for the market. It's not that there's not competition in network goods. The competition takes the form of like all or nothing. You either become the monopolist or not, but that doesn't mean you stay the monopolist. They tend to be serial monopolies. So if I had been giving this lecture 10 years ago and asked how many people were on MySpace, all the hands who were using social media would have been up. So you get a clear market leader, then someone else comes in and challenges it, and you tend to get these tipping points where like the whole market shifts. So that doesn't mean that these are like monopolists who actually can do things like raise price and restrict quantity, because if they start doing that, their competition comes in and undercuts them and steals the whole market from them. In fact, what price do you pay for Facebook?
Your privacy.
Your privacy a little bit is what you trade off on it, right, and get ads sent to you. And the competition in, how many of you use something other than Microsoft Word? Only one? What do you guys, what do you use?
Google.
Google Docs. What do you pay for Google Docs?
Nothing except for advertising, very minimum.
You too?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how are they trying to get into the market? They're coming in at zero price, giving you a service, and Google like is one that's got a chance because they already have like a built-in, and like the Google Circles had a chance because they have a built-in network already through Gmail of maybe getting a tipping point to throw them over. But basically that threat is what keeps all of the other monopolists from competing in a way that doesn't look like this, because they know there's going to be a tipping point where it can switch to somebody else. So same thing, people think of like Microsoft as the monopoly in all the word processing software and spreadsheets and stuff. That wasn't the case before. It's a serial monopoly. It was WordPerfect before that. And if you were doing spreadsheets in the early in the 90s, it was Lotus 123 was the name of it. And Microsoft came along and challenged, in part by bundling the thing called Office together, was able to outcompete the other ones and flip it off. In fact, what happened with the Internet Explorer stuff?
Antitrust lawsuits.
You had antitrust lawsuits, but this again was a network industry where you're trying to make your web browser, where different websites were all going to make it so it's calibrated to your web browser better. So that's going to be a network industry. What did Microsoft come in and charge for Internet Explorer? Zero. They bundled it in for free, and that's how you get an antitrust case against you, is you are giving away your product for free, so therefore you must be a harmful monopolist, right? Incidentally, how many of you use Internet Explorer now? Basically none of you. Yvonne, me too, sometimes. I finally switched over to Google Chrome, but basically it got displaced by Firefox and then Google Chrome when we look at the market share of what people are using right now. And I think probably the network effect of web browsers is lighter than in some of the other things. But the classic cases of this, like DVDs first. Remember, we all had VHS. Actually, you guys probably don't all remember because you're young enough now that you probably mostly had DVDs, but there was a time where it was all VHSs, and Laserdisc came into challenge, and it was like a record-sized thing. And the video stores picked up some of them, but it never really took off. It took DVDs to come in and displace it. So it is like there's a built-in mechanism that tends to solidify you, and you have to have something good enough as an alternative to like kick it out. But it doesn't mean, the point I want to make on it is, it doesn't mean there's not competition, it just, the competition looks different. It's for the whole market rather than a spot within it. But knowing that you face that competition, it makes them not behave like this in the first place. So it wouldn't be a harmful monopoly in the sense that would be defined in this graph. Other reasons why monopoly might be a good thing. Yeah?
Maybe ease of use. I mean, for Microsoft, for Windows users, it was really easy.
Okay, so yeah, they could just be monopolists because they develop better products than other people, and there's a reason why you're number one, and only one, because you're better than everybody else. Sure. Yeah?
I guess you're getting into like legal philosophy, like you consider the state a legal monopoly, and it can only provide those services.
I do believe some monopolies are harmful. That might be one of them. So staying away from the state right now, and I will get back to the state and its role in other monopolies in a few minutes. In the general case, one is incentive for innovation. So at least within the context of the state right now, if it wasn't for monopolies on drugs when they come out, you'd probably have very, very little innovation in terms of new medicines. It takes about 10 years and $1 billion to bring a new drug to market in the United States. One big reason, of course, is because we have an FDA that imposes all of these requirements and stuff. So I do think competition would look a lot different without that. But given that, if you have those big fixed costs and people can duplicate your drug right away, if you don't have a monopoly on it when you're done, you're probably not going to innovate it in the first place. Aside from that, just the idea that you can become the monopoly is an incentive to innovate, like profit opportunities are incentives to innovate. Incidentally, it also points to what is one big cure for monopoly? The very fact that you have one. You're not immune from competition, but big profits, in fact, actually just inefficiencies. This is a good little phrase to remember. Today's inefficiencies are tomorrow's profit opportunities. So when you see inefficiencies in the world, if you can come up with a way to make money off them, you can probably kill the inefficiency and make money for yourself. So when you get a monopolist who has high prices and big profits, that's a big green light, a signal to other entrepreneurs. How can we innovate around this? So even when we come to like natural monopolies, so telephones are a traditional example, right? You have to string the telephone wires. Does anybody think that anybody has a monopoly on telephones today as a natural monopoly? There's an obvious substitute, right? What's your substitute for a land? How many of you even own a landline where you live? Yvonne and I are going to be the oddballs, always raising our hands on this, but about a third of you do, 2/3 of you don't, it looked like. So what's happened? The rise of cell phones. How about just using the internet and Skyping or FaceTiming? There's a lot of alternatives other than your telephone landline. Basically, if that monopoly just been left alone with high prices, there's an incentive to innovate around it. Yeah?
Or you can use something like Google Voice. I know that it's becoming prevalent as well. And that also transcripts the message, which is scary in itself, but it's still possible.
Yeah, cool. There's like lots of ways that you innovate around these things. So I think this, you got to remember, is a static picture. It's a snapshot in time. Given the technologies that exist right now, this is your inefficiency. This lost gains for trade. But if we look at this in a dynamic sense, this doesn't tell you what new products are being innovated specifically because there's the potential for this profit. Because it could be that this market wouldn't have existed, which means your deadweight loss isn't this, it's the whole darn thing is gone. So this dynamically creates the incentive to create new markets. It also creates the incentive to work around it so that this does not perpetuate. And in terms of the natural monopolies that are there, at a point in time they're inefficient, but by leaving the market process open to competition, it leaves the ability for the market to find a better way to get around it in the future. Doesn't mean that it's not snapshot inefficient, but the question is what's going to be better in the long run. So often what will come in then is proposals for government to do something about it. So one option is basically leave the market process free to competition. We're going to get innovation because of high profits. You're going to get competition for the market instead of in the market for natural monopolies, network type goods. The other is let's have the government do something about it. Once government's going to do something about it, we can't just assume that we can draw the ideal solution on the graph and government will therefore do it. I know you guys got a lecture earlier this week in public choice. In fact, Yvonne, did you give that one? So you've already had the idea that just because we say government should do something doesn't mean that's how government actually will do it. We have to worry about the incentives and the information of the politicians. So let's take just a brief snapshot at history of how government has done some of this and what the consequences are. So antitrust. What was the famous antitrust law? Yes?
The Sherman Antitrust Act?
Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, right? So this is the first one that makes monopoly illegal. And if you took like a high school history class, you probably had like that picture in your textbook of like these heads on bags of money, and it's like labeled sugar trust and steel trust, and they're all like laughing and rich and like the idea that they're exploiting the people or something. Now remember, if monopoly power means anything, to be harmful this is, it means the ability to restrict quantity and raise price. Well, the 51st Congress is the one that passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. They were nice enough to give us a list of the so-called monopolized industries in the United States. That list, while it sounds a little funky today, includes salt, petroleum, zinc, steel, a particular type of coal, steel rails, sugar, lead, liquor, twine, iron, nuts and washers, jute, castor oil, cottonseed oil, leather, linseed oil, and matches. So that's the list that they were supposedly passing this law in response to. Now, keeping this in mind of restrict output, raise price, we can actually look to history and see what was going on in these industries at the time. Well, output in the decade leading up to the Sherman Antitrust Act increased by 24%. So how did it compare in these monopolized industries? Output grew 175%. In some of them, like steel, 258%, coal, 153%, steel rails, 142%, sugar, 75%. It's like orders of magnitude bigger than what the normal economic expansion was coming from these so-called monopolies who were restricting output and raising price. Incidentally, by the way, when the Sherman Antitrust Act was being passed, they didn't even have these models of monopoly among academic economists. So it couldn't be that they were passing them in response to this. Something else has got to be going on. But even looking back, often what you find is people who come up with market failure theories for things are giving ex post justification to what a government was doing before such a theory ever existed and before actually there was actually a market failure in it from a prior government intervention. But that's a different story. So what about price? So the price level actually declined by 7% during that decade. In these, steel rails down 53%, sugar down 22%, lead down 12%, zinc down 20%. Basically, we're not finding any evidence in these industries of restricting quantity, raising price. Quite the opposite. We're finding expanding output, lowering price, exactly what we want the process of competition to do. It might be the case that there's a single producer, but if that single producer is behaving like a competitive market would be, what's the beef? Who cares just that they're big? They're doing exactly what we want the market process to come up with for us. In fact, they're doing it better than what anybody else in the market process could be doing for us. Now, some people might, what would be a standard critique of how could they still be monopolies then if they're doing this? Or bad monopolies? Yeah.
Well, they can still be acting in a competitive fashion just through innovation. I mean, if the process of extraction and creation is less, then obviously they're going to pass that savings on to the consumer as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's consistent with them doing what we want the market process to do. So, but one person might respond to this, but it's predatory pricing. They're just undercutting their competitors so they can push them out of the market, and then they'll get the whole market share for themselves, and they'll jack the price up. Okay, first of all, just the smell test. For a decade, you're going to price to make yourself losses for a decade? No. Secondly, theoretically, actually, there was the very first Journal of Law Economics issue, a guy, John McGee, wrote an article that basically destroys the notion of predatory pricing of being an effective business strategy. Because if you're only gaining your monopoly by pricing below cost to get your competitors out, well, it makes sense for a lot of them to temporarily shut down and re-enter the market. And unless there's very high costs of re-entry, it's not going to work. Because then you're going to raise your price up above what you couldn't already outcompete them on, which means they can come back in at an abnormal price and make more money. And as you gain market share, you're making bigger and bigger losses, while they're making smaller and smaller profits. If we have effective credit markets, we should be able to get loans to tide ourselves over until our predatory pricer goes out, as long as we understand that that's what he's doing. So predatory pricing doesn't quite cut it. Yeah?
Wouldn't one counterexample be like a monopolistic competition, say, between loss leaders, bookstores in this case, Barnes & Noble and Borders being the two prevalent ones in the United States? They were operating as loss leaders, putting small bookstores out of business, and then eventually one lost out, as we know.
So where has been the recouping of going to high monopoly prices with them?
Well, they're raising their prices slightly over where they were from the public. So the publishers give them a set discount, and so when they offer something at 45% off, it's not 45% off. I mean, obviously we all know that, but they've raised the prices slowly, because before they both would be 50% off and see who goes to which bookstore, but now it's 45%. So while the price of the book is still cheaper than it would be normally, they've raised the prices slightly in the absence of competition.
I don't know that there's an absence of competition here. It seems like there's vigorous competition in it.
Well, the internet, but I mean, as far as like physical location.
But even then, like the physical location, all those small bookstores are all like linked in on, if you go like abe.com, of linking all those small bookstores together so that you could search that, and now they sell actually like your price differentials and like your good find, if you like old books and stuff, your good finds that you used to be able to get are much harder to do now because they all put it up on Abe and know what they're can sell to a larger market.
They use above the tree line, which is a thing that links all small bookstores in the United States.
Yeah. So it seems to me like there's vigorous competition in that. I don't know, we can talk about the specifics in detail later. But it seems like a pretty competitive market to me. So how is like some of the classic cases then in antitrust behaving then? So we can look at Standard Oil. So Standard Oil is the first big antitrust case. The verdict comes down in 1911. So here's the postcard version of the history. In 1870, when Rockefeller reorganized the company into Standard Oil, he had a 4% share of the kerosene market, and it was selling for 26 cents per gallon. By 1880, just 10 years later, his market share was up to 80 to 85%. How did he get this big increase in his market share? Well, he insourced a lot of the things other companies were outsourcing, was able to do it cheaper, hiring coopers to make his own barrels and such for much cheaper. Main thing was a lot of innovation. He hired chemists who came up with over 300 different byproducts from the process of making kerosene that he could sell in other ways, which got his price per barrel then way down below everybody else. So his cost of refining a gallon fell from 3 cents in 1870 to under a half cent by 1885. His market share got up to about 90% during this time. From 1870 to 1885, the price then of kerosene dropped from 26 cents down to 8 cents, and by the turn of the century had fallen down to 6 cents. So this sounds like a market guy innovating and doing exactly what we want the process of competition to do, but the first big antitrust suit comes against him. Incidentally, well before 1911, what started happening to Standard Oil? Actually, what two big things occurred in the market for oil right around the turn of the century in the United States? Two game changers.
Automobiles.
Automobiles, right? So it's a switch from kerosene to gasoline. That's one major one. The other one, where did Standard Oil get their oil from?
Domestically.
Standard Oil of Ohio was the name of the company even, right? It was Ohio and Pennsylvania oil. Turn of the century, what do we hit? Oil boom in Texas. Standard Oil is late to the table on both of these. He's late to the table going to Texas, he's late to the table in gasoline. What happens? Now, it doesn't mean he totally misses it. He's like any other competitor, starts adjusting. But instead of for that couple decades where he was like ahead of everybody and doing a better thing, he finally missed it. The entrepreneur, some other entrepreneurs got out ahead of him. So he wasn't immune from competition then. His market share fell from its high of 90% in the 1890s to 68% by 1907, down to 64% by 1911. So he was still the big player. But that big player wasn't immune from the process of competition. Once he stopped basically outcompeting everybody, he started losing market share to them. Despite this, antitrust rulings come down against him. This is something, when you empower the government to do antitrust, basically there's different ways that firms can compete. They can compete by better trying to service consumers, or they can compete by complaining to the government or filing their own complaints in court and bringing antitrust charges against people. The probably worst indictment that is in antitrust history is the Alcoa Aluminum Company. It comes down in 1945. Actually, it was an extended case over a number of years. Eventually kind of overturned, but that, which by the way is another thing that you see very common in antitrust cases. One court rules one way, the next court rules another, the next court rules another, all depending on like how you define market share sometimes, because anything can be a monopoly if we define it narrowly enough, or nothing can be a monopoly if we define it broadly enough. Berkeley has a monopoly, so you see Berkeley has a monopoly on food within 50 yards of here. Is that a relevant monopoly? Most of us would say obviously not, because it's easy to walk somewhere else to get food. But where do you draw the line? Often different judges draw different lines. In fact, Alan Greenspan famously said about antitrust, it's like the world of Alice's Wonderland where everything seemingly is but apparently isn't, and you don't know what the law says until the judge's hammer comes down after the fact. Basically, there's no way to know. In fact, actually, your prices are too high, you're a monopolist. Your prices are the same as everybody else, you're colluding. Your prices are lower than everybody else, you're predatory pricing. How are you going to do it? So here's the verdict that came down from Judge Learned Hand in Alcoa. Just listen to this and tell me what you think this sounds like. It was not innovative. By the way, he finds them guilty. And now this is what he says. It was not inevitable that Alcoa should always anticipate increases in the demand for ingot, be prepared to supply them. Nothing compelled it to keep doubling and redoubling its capacity before others could enter the field. It insists it never excluded competitors, but we can think of no more effective exclusion than to progressively embrace each new opportunity as it opened, to face every newcomer with increased capacity, already geared into a great organization, having the advantage of experienced trade connections and elite personnel. He just told us exactly what we want the process of competition to do. He said Alcoa is better at doing it than everybody else, and it was running out to this point, basically, each and every opportunity it got. Therefore, you're guilty and we should break you up. So the idea, if we believe even that this can be an inefficiency in a snapshot of time, the idea that antitrust necessarily fixes this is wrong, because antitrust, as often as it would try to fix this, is going to be used in cases like Alcoa or Standard Oil or others to actually break up ones that are doing exactly what we want, because competitors can go in there and through public choice reasons basically rent-seek through the judicial system then to try to hurt their harmful competitors. And I would argue also that that's much of what went on with Microsoft as well. All right, so as we're kind of winding down in time here. So next option would be, well, okay, we have a monopolist, and let's say it's like a natural monopoly one, because this is where they've done it many times before. Let's just regulate it. So we'll say, okay, sure, you can be the single seller, but we know if we leave you to your own devices, you're going to do this game. Instead, we're going to regulate you. We'll regulate you down to price equals marginal cost, or price equals, actually usually it's price equals average cost. So what your average cost of all your production is, we're going to limit your price to that or that plus a markup. So one common way of doing this is like a return on assets. You can get like a 5% return on what your total investment is. This perverts incentives, though. Have you ever been to government-regulated monopolies? Quite often, if they have rate of return regulation like that, you walk in and it's like a palace. It's like plush carpet, nice paintings on the wall, fancy furniture everywhere. Well, hell yeah, what's their incentive to control cost? Nothing. You're not letting them make extra monetary profit by cutting cost and optimally pricing. Instead, the more cost they have, the more total dollars they actually get to claim, because they're getting a return on their, basically, investment. So you end up like capital stuffing it, or they'll call it like the gold-plated water cooler effect of like all your water coolers have gold plates, which it's not ever that absurd, but that's basically what's going on. And for that matter then, once it's a regulated monopoly, what happens to the incentive for innovation? Oh, I come up with a new and better way of doing this. Do I make more profit? Nope. And often then, this leaves consumers worse off. So actually a classic example would be like cable television. Regulated for a while. Very little innovation. Deregulation of cable television begins, I believe it's the early 1980s. Late 1970s, early 1980s. I'm going to get the year slightly off. But basically the process of deregulation starts first for like commercial pay channels, and then for overall cable TV. Well, what happened then? Proliferation of, it's late 1970s when it starts, because ESPN comes about around this time. Proliferation of new cable channels. So did price go up after deregulation? Yeah. But so did subscriptions, actually. Well, what's that tell you? So price went up. Usually it'd say, okay, demand curve, price goes up, quantity is going to go down. Well, actually, quantity went up, because this demand curve didn't stay the same. Once you had innovation of much more cable channels with better programming, even though like things like Lifetime and Oxygen come about because of this, and that wants to me stab myself, most people judge this as a reason to buy more TV. So like the demand curve goes out. So it's telling you, yeah, you lost from having the regulation in terms of the price went up, but you got so much more innovation. People were actually happier with higher prices and better products, because now we could innovate around it more. So when you end up doing the rate of return regulation or kind of economic regulation, you often end up perverting the incentive for innovation. Which, to conclude for our last few minutes on this, and I know we started late on this one, but I'm trying to shorten this lecture to keep us back on time. There are harmful sources of monopoly, but I would argue that most of them don't arise in the market. In fact, the original meaning of monopoly, in like the Adam Smith sense, was it was a grant of government privilege. It was a grant of government privilege that said you could be the single seller or supplier, or a small number of you could be sellers and suppliers but exclude others. And we have tons of that in the United States now. And those, I'd argue, are harmful monopolies or oligopolies, because the process of competition is being prevented. This is not literally a monopoly because there are multiple producers, but it's a form of it, which is occupational licensure. Go to different states now, and I forget how many occupations are licensed now in total, but it's tons across states are licensed now. From things like what you all think of as licensed. So what's a license mean? You can't practice without this government certification. But then they'll also put quantitative controls on it. So the American Medical Association basically has a monopoly over how many people can become doctors. And they use this to exclude other people who could compete with them, like nurse practitioners, from doing services that you really don't need a doctor to do. But it's down to like the absurd. If we were in Arizona and you wanted to be a rain dancer, you need a government license to do it. Supposedly, right, a government license is to ensure quality of rain dancing. We're only going to make sure they dance when it really gets you rain. But this is in occupations all across the spectrum in the United States. I think that's a harmful grant of monopoly privilege. You'll also have things where it's a grant of monopoly privilege of import quotas, and you'll give one company the right to import the goods and not other companies. These are all grants of monopoly privilege that do this, that aren't part of the market's process of competition that corrects it, and that are really created for public choice reasons of rent seeking in the first place. Often when it can be sold as some bill of goods to consumers of, well, we're doing this to protect you really, because you don't know enough about this market. And what you end up finding is that the industry itself captures the regulators and then regulates the industry for the benefit of that industry rather than the consumers. So I think we need to oppose government-granted monopolies, but not market-generated monopolies, because market-generated monopolies aren't inefficient in a dynamic sense. To the extent that they're inefficient in a static sense, they're part of their own solution over time. And I don't even like the way this is drawn, because if we're being consistent subjectivists, this is a meaningless graph to start with. Any final questions on monopoly stuff? Cool. Let's take like a, let's say, 5-minute break so I can set up the PowerPoint, and then we'll start up on the next one. Thanks.